On the morning of the 2nd of May, following the May Day joust, Anne rose in her apartments at the Greenwich Palace. Henry had not returned, and instead she was met by her uncle and a number of the king's privy yeomanry. She was taken before the council and interrogated. The council did not, however, disclose the charges. They had yet to be finalised, and it seems that Anne would unintentionally provide all of the evidence. Anne complained that she had been cruelly handled, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, distanced himself from his niece and tutted 3 times, shaking his head. Anne was then placed in a barge and rowed to the Tower of London. She had no time to collect any of her personal belongings, and her ladies were left at the palace. It was the same journey she had made on her greatest and most triumphant occasion prior to her coronation. There were, however, no elaborate barges to accompany her, nor crowds of cheering onlookers. Instead, puzzled and curious Londoners looked on to the royal barge, with the Queen surrounded by an unusual number of the King's Guard. It has become part of the Tower legend that Anne was rowed into the fortress through the Watergate, now known as the infamous Traitors' Gate. It is far more likely, however, that she alighted at the Tower Wharf and entered the fortress at the royal entrance of the Byward Postern, where she had entered almost 3 years earlier before her coronation. There was, however, no king to greet her. Instead, the Tower Lieutenant, William Kingston. Anne looked about the outer ward and asked, "Mr. Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" He replied, "No, madam. You should go into your lodging that you lay in at your coronation." Anne, having shown such courage, now broke down into tears. "It is too good for me. Jesu, have mercy on me," she cried, kneeling into the Tower cobbles. Kingston then reported that she fell into a great laughing. She was then taken through the gate into the palace that she would never leave again. "Shall I die without justice?" Anne asked her jailer. "The poorest subject the king hath had justice," he replied. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, had been arrested shortly after his sister at the Palace of York Place, and had been examined on the spot. He had, as Norris had before him, denied all charges against him, but arrived at the Tower shortly after Anne. She was lodged with 4 ladies, who showed little compassion towards her. Initially, Anne was advised she could not communicate with anyone unless Lady Kingston, William's wife, was present. This was impractical, as although 2 of the women slept in Anne's chamber, Lady Kingston was lodged in the neighbouring room. It soon became clear to Cromwell that it was not in his interest to keep Anne silent, as soon she began babbling incriminating evidence against her. Anne had not been given the fine details of the charges against her, the reason being that Anne had yet to provide Cromwell with the information he was so desperate for. In trying to establish why she had been imprisoned, she fed her own fate. She remembered how Francis Weston had conversed with her, and that she had commented on how he loved her kinswoman, Mrs. Shelton, and not his own wife. Following the precedent of chivalrous courtly love, he had replied that he had loved one in her own house better than both, and when Anne asked, "Who is that?" he replied, "Yourself." These details were quickly passed to Cromwell, and within hours Weston was in the Tower. On the 4th of May, William Brereton had been imprisoned in the Tower, and by the 8th of May, Sir Richard Page and Sir Thomas Wyatt were also welcomed into the fortress. Anne became extremely unstable at this point, swinging from hope and confidence to despair and sometimes vengeance. She wildly claimed that there would be no reign in England until she was released from the Tower. She flipped between extreme moods, incriminating her and her inmates unknowingly. What is interesting to note is it seems that the questioning of both Anne and the other prisoners does not seem to have been extended further than the initial stages. In the 2nd week of May, George Boleyn asked when he should come before the King's Council, and Anne stated that she had much marvelled that the King's Council does not come to her. The reason for this was they can provide no further evidence, and Cromwell had already begun twisting Anne's innocent truth into treason. On the 12th of May, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton were rowed from the Watergate to Westminster, where they stood trial. Smeaton confessed 3 times to adultery with the Queen. However, the other 3 accused protested their innocence, to no avail. All were found guilty and condemned to die a traitor's death. They returned to the Tower, with Kingston's ceremonial axe facing them, demonstrating to the people of London that they had been condemned. For security, it was arranged that the Queen and her brother should not make the journey to Westminster, but instead would be tried in the Great Hall within the confines of the Tower on the 15th of May. Great stands were erected within the hall, and 2,000 spectators sat eagerly awaiting the historic event. The trial that they were about to witness was a show trial. The verdict for Anne had effectively been given when her supposed lovers had been condemned. George Boleyn, however, had not. It was decided, therefore, to try the Queen first. Technically, as Anne had already been proven guilty, her condemnation of incest as well as adultery would condemn her brother. Anne entered the Great Hall, and at last heard the charges that had been trumped up against her. She had no legal representation, nor had she been given the charges in advance in order to prepare her alibi. As well as adultery and incest, she had been accused of imagining the king's death by promising herself to Norris. Adultery was not a crime punishable by death, although by the time Catherine Howard was to stand trial, it had been made so. It was imagining the king's death that would carry the appalling death sentence. It was also alleged that she had poisoned Catherine and planned to do the same to Mary. By all accounts, Anne provided evidence to the contrary for all of the charges against her and held the stand well. However, it made no difference. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, acting as Lord High Steward, condemned his niece to death by means of burning or decapitation at the king's pleasure. Anne advised the court that she was resigned to her fate, but regretted that the men who were innocent and loyal to the king should also suffer. Anne was then returned to her apartments, and George stood trial. He defended himself amiably also, and defied Cromwell during the proceedings. It was this act that confirmed his fate. Cromwell handed him a parchment detailing an accusation against him. He advised George to confirm if it be true, but not to disclose the content to the court. George defied him, and read aloud that it had been alleged that he had commented that the king was impotent and unable to bear an issue. George was sentenced to death. 2 days later, the 5 condemned men were taken from their cells to Tower Hill. They were all pardoned the horror of the traitor's death and had their punishment reduced to beheading. An extra tall scaffold was erected so that the vast crowds of thousands could bear witness to the historic event. Historians have debated as to whether Anne was made to watch the death of her brother and her supposed lovers. It is extremely doubtful, as the only cell which has a clear vantage point of the scaffold site on Tower Hill is the high cell of the Bell Tower, which housed Sir Thomas Wyatt. He and Page were never tried, and were released from the Tower. However, Wyatt did indeed witness the horrors of the public scaffold on the 17th of May. He wrote so poignantly, "These bloody days have broken my heart. My lust, my youth, did them depart." The men died well, however Smeaton maintained his guilt, even at the moment of death. The men were then buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the walls of the Tower, and another grave was prepared for a 6th corpse, that of Anne.